Hi, good people. First, I want to thank all my subscribers and those taking time to like my videos. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much for taking time to support me. Whoa, the gift that keeps giving. Watch one among so many trading videos about P. Diddy. Watch this video.
Typically, the victim is lured into a situation where he or she is given a drink. Typically, that drink, reported by these victims, is apparently laced with something. Once that drink takes effect, the perpetrators perform all kinds of sexual acts on the victims, many times passing him or her around as other people watch and enjoy the show, and then leave the victim ashamed, confused, injured, and wondering what happened. When the victim reaches out, he or she is told not to say anything. Sometimes there are threats of physical violence or financial repercussions or bodily harm.
Flying has been my life for as long as I can remember. For years, I've piloted planes for all kinds of people. Regular families going on long-awaited vacations, business travelers rushing to close deals, and the biggest names in the entertainment industry. I've flown private jets for the rich and powerful, touching down in nearly every corner of the globe. My job has taken me to places I could never have imagined visiting when I first started. For most pilots, flying becomes second nature, a routine that blends focus with precision. But nothing about this flight would feel routine. Nothing about it would fit into the realm of what I thought was possible. It started on what I thought would be an ordinary morning, the kind of day where everything feels predictable. I was in the kitchen, standing over the stove as the smell of sizzling pancakes filled the air. My kids were running around the house, their voices loud and full of energy as they scrambled to get ready for school. My wife, as usual, was trying to keep everything organized, reminding the kids not to forget their backpacks and helping them tie their shoes. It was chaotic in the way that only a family morning can be, but it was comforting too. These were the moments I cherished most. In the middle of the commotion, my phone buzzed on the counter. At first, I thought about ignoring it. Whatever it was could wait. But when I glanced at the screen and saw my manager's name, I felt that familiar pull of responsibility. Calls from him weren't common, and they were almost always urgent. I picked up, bracing myself for whatever last-minute assignment he was about to throw at me. His voice was rushed, almost frantic. "Diddy needs a pilot," he said, getting straight to the point. "It's an emergency. He's hosting one of his legendary parties, and the usual two pilots are both out sick. You're the only one who can step in." I paused, my mind racing. Diddy wasn't just any celebrity. He was a cultural icon, a man known for his larger-than-life parties and extravagant lifestyle. Flying someone like him wasn't just a job, it was an event. But that didn't make the decision any easier. My manager could sense my hesitation and quickly added, "Listen, the money is insane. I'm talking enough to cover you for a long time. And this isn't like your usual flights. You'll have a co-pilot, and everything will be taken care of. Plus, you might even get invited to the party. You could end up staying at his mansion, or at least a luxury hotel. You don't want to miss this." The mention of the money made me stop and think. I wasn't desperate, but the kind of payout he was describing was hard to ignore. It wasn't just a paycheck. It was a life-changing amount, enough to give my family some breathing room. Still, something about the whole thing didn't sit right. When I told my wife about it, she immediately frowned. "I don't like this," she said, her voice filled with concern. "It doesn't feel right." I understood her hesitation. She didn't work and stayed home to take care of the kids, which meant my absence would leave her to handle everything on her own. But I tried to reassure her. "It's only for a few days," I said, trying to sound confident. "5 at most. I'll be back before you know it, and the money will be worth it." That night, I packed my bags, trying to focus on the practicalities. I made sure I had all the essentials, clothes, toiletries, and my flight manuals, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease in the back of my mind. Before bed, I kissed my kids goodnight, promising them I'd bring back something special, and hugged my wife tightly. I could tell she still wasn't convinced, but I told myself everything would be fine. The next morning, my alarm went off at 5 a.m., pulling me out of a restless sleep. I got ready quickly, double-checking my bags and making sure I had everything I needed. The drive to the hangar was quieter than usual. Normally, these trips take over an hour, but this time, it only took about 30 minutes. The city was still asleep, the streets dark and empty, and the silence only added to the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. When I arrived, my manager was already there, pacing near the jet. He greeted me with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, handing me a briefing with the flight details. "This is a 5-day gig," he said, emphasizing the timeline. "You'll be flying Diddy and his guests to a private location for one of his exclusive parties. Thousands of celebrities will be there, and you won't have to worry about anything. Everything's covered. The money you're making for this could last you years." I tried to focus on the job, but as I stepped onto the jet, something immediately felt off. The plane was as luxurious as you'd expect for someone like Diddy. Plush leather seats, a fully stocked bar, and state-of-the-art amenities. But then I started noticing the details that didn't belong. Bottles of baby oil were scattered across the cabin, along with what looked like toys, things that made my stomach churn. There were also drinks already set out, and small packets of substances that were clearly drugs. As I walked through the cabin, trying to take it all in, my unease grew. I told myself it was just the eccentricity of wealth, the kind of thing rich people do because they can. My co-pilot arrived a few minutes later, and we went through our pre-flight checks together. Technically, everything seemed fine, but the atmosphere felt heavy, like the plane itself was holding secrets I wasn't meant to know. And then Diddy arrived. He came with an entourage of models, women so stunning it was almost intimidating to look at them. They moved with an air of confidence that made it clear they were used to being the center of attention. But they weren't the only ones boarding the jet. Behind them came the kids, about 10 of them, boys and girls dressed in elaborate outfits that made them look like porcelain dolls. Their faces were painted with makeup, their eyes downcast, and their expressions eerily blank. They didn't speak, didn't make eye contact, and moved with a stiffness that made my skin crawl. I couldn't help but wonder what they were doing there. But as a pilot, I knew better than to ask questions. My job was to fly the plane, not to pry into the lives of the passengers. Once we were in the air, I couldn't resist stealing glances through the small mirror window in the cockpit. What I saw made my stomach churn. The adults were drinking heavily. Some were sniffing substances off the table, and others were engaging in acts I can't even bring myself to describe. And then there were the kids, silent, still, and eerily detached from the chaos around them. At one point, I saw them being handed drinks. I turned to my co-pilot, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you seeing this?" He didn't even look at me. "Don't," he said flatly. "Just don't. It's their jet, their rules. We're here to fly, not to watch." I wanted to argue, to tell him that this wasn't normal, that something was deeply, disturbingly wrong. But I knew he was right. There was nothing I could do. When we landed, the beauty of the island took my breath away. At first, the water was crystal clear, the mansions glimmered under the sun, and everything about the place screamed wealth and exclusivity. But beneath the surface, I could feel the wrongness of it all, like an undercurrent of something dark and sinister. The passengers disembarked, leaving behind a cabin that was a mess, spilled drinks, stains, and an overwhelming stench. I was just relieved I didn't have to clean it up. From there, we were taken to a nearby hotel reserved for staff. My co-pilot and I shared a modest room, which I didn't mind. But just as we were starting to settle in, there was a knock at the door. One of Diddy's guards stood there, his face emotionless, as he handed us outfits and said, "You'll be helping at the party tonight. Be ready by 8 p.m. and leave your phones in the room, no exceptions. When I unfolded the outfit, my heart sank. It was a short skirt, a women's outfit entirely inappropriate for a man. I tried to argue, but the guard cut me off. "These are the rules," he said coldly. "You don't follow them, you'll regret it." By the time 8 p.m. rolled around, I had no choice but to wear the skirt. The humiliation was unbearable as I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. The skirt barely reached my knees, and it felt all kinds of wrong. I was a grown man, a professional pilot, reduced to wearing an outfit that made me feel exposed and embarrassed. My co-pilot was in the same outfit, his expression mirroring my own discomfort and disbelief. We didn't say much to each other as we got ready, the tension in the room heavy and unspoken. There was no point in complaining or resisting. We both knew what would happen if we didn't follow the rules. When we arrived at the mansion, the security checkpoint was the first indication of how tightly controlled everything was. The guards were tall, intimidating, and methodical in their inspections. They checked us for phones, wires, or any kind of recording devices, patting us down with the same thoroughness you'd expect at an airport, or maybe even more so. I could feel their hands pressing against every pocket, every seam of the ridiculous outfit I was wearing, ensuring there was nothing we could use to document what was happening inside. It wasn't just us. Every staff member went through the same procedure. The atmosphere was tense, the guards' eyes scanning each of us with suspicion, as though daring us to try something stupid. Once we passed the security check, we were ushered into the mansion. The interior was even more lavish than I had imagined, a dizzying display of wealth and excess. The floors were marble, polished to such a high shine that they reflected the dazzling chandeliers overhead. Every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, ornate and impossibly expensive. But despite the grandeur, the air inside felt oppressive, almost suffocating. It was hot, unbearably so, and the heat seemed to amplify the strange, heavy atmosphere that hung over everything. We were quickly briefed on our duties by another guard, a man who towered over everyone and spoke with an authority that made it clear he wasn't to be questioned. He gathered all the workers into a circle and gave us a rundown of the rules. "Don't ask questions," he said, his voice low and firm. "Don't talk too much. Move quickly. And if anyone refuses a drink, you let us know immediately." His gaze swept over all of us, making sure his words sunk in. "Most importantly," he added, "you drink too. No exceptions. If you don't drink, you're out. And trust me, you don't want to know what happens if you're out." The warning sent a chill down my spine. The way he said it with such casual menace made it clear that out didn't mean being sent home. It meant something far worse. As the party started, I focused on my task, serving drinks. The trays were heavy with glasses filled with colorful, shimmering liquids, and I tried to move quickly, avoiding eye contact with the guests. The heat was stifling, and sweat began to bead on my forehead almost immediately. The other workers were moving just as fast, their faces blank as they carried out their duties without a word. It wasn't long before I noticed something strange about the drinks. One of the women preparing them was adding a fine pink powder to each glass, stirring it in until it dissolved completely. I couldn't help but ask, my curiosity getting the better of me. "What is that?" I said, keeping my voice low. She turned to me sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Didn't they tell you not to question anything?" she snapped. "Do it again and you're done." Her tone was icy, and the way she stared at me made it clear that I had crossed a line. I quickly muttered an apology and turned away, my heart racing. The guests were eager to take the drinks, their movements becoming more erratic with each sip. The atmosphere in the mansion shifted as the party went on, growing wilder and more unhinged. People began to strip off their clothes, their actions becoming more bizarre and animalistic. Some collapsed onto the floor, their bodies limp and lifeless, only to be revived moments later by injections administered by staff who seemed disturbingly well prepared for such situations. And then there were the kids. They wandered through the chaos, their small figures almost swallowed up by the crowd. Unlike the adults, they weren't drinking or dancing, but their presence was impossible to ignore. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide and unblinking, and their expressions frozen in a way that suggested fear far beyond their years. At one point, I saw a group of men and women leading several of the children into a side room. The kids didn't resist, but their body language spoke volumes. They were stiff, hesitant, and visibly terrified. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched them disappear behind the door, and I felt an overwhelming urge to do something, to say something. But what could I do? I was a nobody in this world, just a pilot who had been dragged into something far beyond his control. As the night wore on, the heat and the intensity of the party became almost unbearable. The drinks were everywhere, and people's behavior grew more and more disturbing. At one point, a guard approached me and my co-pilot holding out 2 glasses. His expression was unreadable, but his tone left no room for argument. "Drink," he said simply. I hesitated, the memory of the pink powder flashing through my mind. But the guard's gaze was cold and unyielding, and I knew there was no way out. "You have to," he insisted. "Everyone drinks. It's the rule." I exchanged a nervous glance with my co-pilot, who looked just as uneasy as I felt. But neither of us dared to refuse. I took the glass, the liquid inside a strange, shimmering color, and brought it to my lips. The taste was bitter, thick and unnatural, coating my throat as I swallowed. Almost immediately my head began to spin, and the world around me seemed to warp and shift. The sounds of the party became muffled and distant, like I was underwater, and the lights blurred together into a kaleidoscope of colors. The next thing I knew, I woke up on the cold floor of the mansion. My body ached all over, my muscles sore and my skin covered in scratches. I had no idea how much time had passed, but the room was quieter now, the once lively crowd reduced to a handful of people who were either unconscious or moving sluggishly. As I tried to sit up, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I wasn't wearing my outfit anymore. I scrambled to my feet, frantically searching for something to cover myself. Eventually, I found the skirt I had been given earlier. It was soaked in baby oil, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel less exposed. As I pulled it on, I felt a wave of shame wash over me. The cameras were still there, their lenses trained on me like vultures circling a dying animal. Before I could fully process what was happening, another drink was thrust into my hands. I tried to refuse, shaking my head and backing away. But the guard who handed it to me wasn't having it. "Drink," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't want to make this difficult for yourself." I don't remember much after that. Whatever was in that drink took hold of me quickly, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up again. When I woke up to the sensation of ice-cold water pouring over me, I gasped, my body jerking upright as the shock forced me back into consciousness. The water was freezing, biting against my skin, and it soaked through the already thin and humiliating outfit I had on. My mind was a haze, disoriented and struggling to piece together what had just happened. I blinked several times, trying to focus on the figure standing in front of me. It was a man, one of the guards, and he was holding an empty bucket. His expression was a mix of amusement and impatience, like he had done this sort of thing too many times to count. "You've been out for a while," he said casually, as if this were a normal occurrence. His voice was calm, almost mocking, and it made my skin crawl. "We had to wake you up. Your flight leaves in 8 hours, so get it together." I sat there for a moment, trying to process his words. 8 hours? My brain couldn't reconcile that with how much time I thought had passed. To me, it felt like I had only been here for a few hours. Surely, I thought, he must have been mistaken. "Why so early?" I managed to croak out, my throat dry and hoarse, as though I hadn't spoken in days. The guard's smirk widened, and he crouched down to my level, his face uncomfortably close to mine. "Early?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "It's been 4 days. Time flies when you're having fun, huh?" He let out a low chuckle as he stood back up, towering over me. My heart sank at his words. 4 days? There was no way that could be true. It felt like I had been trapped in some kind of warped reality where time didn't follow the usual rules. The idea that I had lost days of my life without even realizing it filled me with a deep, gnawing dread. I tried to protest, shaking my head weakly. No, that's not possible," I muttered, my voice barely audible. But before I could say anything more, the guard pulled out a tablet and pressed play. What I saw on the screen made my stomach churn. It was a recording of me, my face, my body, my actions that I couldn't even begin to comprehend or explain. The person on the screen was me, but it wasn't me. I watched in horror as the footage showed me doing things I couldn't believe I was capable of. Things that went against everything I stood for, everything I believed in. I felt bile rising in my throat as I turned away from the screen. "That's not me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You did this to me. You drugged me." My words felt weak, powerless, and I knew even as I spoke them that they wouldn't make a difference. The guard just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Maybe we did," he said with a shrug. "Maybe we didn't. Doesn't matter, does it? What matters is what happens if this gets out." He leaned in closer, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What do you think your wife will say when she sees this? Your kids, your friends, your career?" I felt the walls closing in around me, the weight of his words pressing down on my chest. "Please," I begged, my voice cracking. "Don't show this to anyone. Don't ruin my family." The guard smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent chills down my spine. "We won't," he said smoothly. "As long as you keep your mouth shut, this stays between us. But if you talk..." He trailed off, leaving the threat hanging in the air. I nodded weakly, too afraid to say anything more. The reality of my situation hit me like a freight train. I was trapped, bound by the knowledge that they had complete control over me. Whatever I had done, whatever they had made me do, was now a weapon they could use against me at any moment. When I was finally allowed to leave the room, my legs felt shaky, like they could give out at any moment. I returned to the hotel where my co-pilot was already packing his bags. His eyes were red and swollen, tears streaming silently down his face. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. The weight of what had happened hung heavily between us, unspoken, but understood. The drive back to the hangar was silent. Neither of us said a word as the car wound through the narrow roads of the island, the beauty of the landscape completely lost on us now. When we arrived at the jet, we went through our usual pre-flight checks, inspecting every inch of the plane to ensure it was ready for takeoff. But this time, the routine felt hollow. As we prepared to board, 2 guards approached us, each carrying a large, heavy suitcase. They handed one to me and the other to my co-pilot. "Your payment," one of them said simply, his tone flat. "Consider it a thank you for your cooperation." The weight of the suitcase was almost unbearable as I carried it onto the jet. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see the stacks of cash that were inside, tainted by everything that had happened. It felt like blood money, a constant reminder of the price I had paid. The flight back to Los Angeles was uneventful, but the silence in the cockpit was deafening. My co-pilot and I didn't exchange a single word the entire time. We both knew there was nothing to say. When I finally arrived home, my kids ran to greet me, their faces lighting up with joy. "Daddy's home!" they shouted, throwing their arms around me in a tight hug. I winced as their small hands pressed against the scratches and bruises on my body, but I forced myself to smile. My wife hugged me too, her warmth and love almost overwhelming after everything I had just been through. But as she pulled back, her eyes narrowed slightly. You seem tense, she said softly, concern etched on her face. Are you okay? I nodded quickly, trying to brush off her worry. Just tired, I said, my voice strained.
I hope you watched the video from beginning to the end. It's important. Please remember to subscribe, share, and like. Thank you.